exhibited a very high sense of responsibility with regards to his assignments, because he couldn't have been described in those terms if he wasn't. And I'm convinced that there are certain traits Daniel must have exhibited and which would have contributed to him having such an elevated standing even among his peers. And I think the first is dedication. Dedication to performing the tasks that had been assigned to him. And even though he served under a king who might not have known God, he was showing his dedication to God by his dedication to the work of the king. We cannot say that those who have employed us are necessarily godly or Christian, but in our attitudes to our work, we must demonstrate dedication. And then there was discipline. The self-control that is gained by requiring that rules or orders be obeyed, and the ability to keep working at something that is difficult. Training oneself to do the right thing at the right time, ensuring that rules and regulations are observed. So there was dedication, there was discipline, and then thirdly, there was diligence. Working hard, and also about being faithful, paying attention to detail, and persistent in the goals. So if we are to be, purposeful as Christians and as medical and dental practitioners, we need to exhibit dedication, we need to be disciplined, and we need to be diligent. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 3 to 5, the Apostle Paul uses 3 occupations to illustrate the place of these three virtues in the life of the Christian. He uses the dedication of the soldier. He said, no soldier engages in civilian pursuits because all he's interested in is in pleasing the master. So dedication. And then the discipline of the athlete, because the athlete has to compete according to the set rules. Discipline. And then finally, the hard work of the farmer, the diligence of the farmer. As health professionals dealing with human lives, it is of utmost importance that we remain dedicated to our patients' welfare to demonstrate our dedication to our Lord. We cannot but be disciplined in order to show clearly that we work within the limits of our Christian faith and the limits of our professional calling. Diligence must characterize our pursuit so of achieving the best for our patients and exhibiting the ultimate Christian virtues. It is instructive that Daniel distinguished himself so much by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to elevate him to the second in command position. We may not necessarily be the top of the group, but we must be satisfied that we have done our. This necessarily means that we will strive at all times to position ourselves to offer the best we are capable of, whether public health, risk, or administration. We must take advantage of opportunities for training in order to advance our knowledge, skills, and attitudes, all in an effort to enable us offer better and better services. Excellence should be our operational principle, and a combination of dedication, diligence, and discipline will enable us achieve our goals of best serving the Master who laid down his life for us. We must, in this regard, exhibit the compassion, the humility, and the selflessness that he demonstrated in his task of bringing healing to many, be they rich or poor. Needless to say, we must at all times be motivated and guided by very strong Christian ethical principles. You know, when I read the story of Daniel, it's very striking that they said they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. And I always say, how I wish this could be said of our politicians and rulers. In the past few years, corruption has almost become a normal part of life for the average Ghanaian, much to the destruction of the fabric of the society. We even hear news reports of individuals connected to leadership of the church caught in disturbing acts of financial corruption. And let me emphasize that we are not necessarily immune to this canker as Christian doctors and dentists. We need to be on our guard to reject the allure of acquiring wealth by illicit means. There are certain practices being engaged in at various levels of our health care system which are nothing short of exploitation of the poor patient or exploitation of the unfortunate lapses or deficits in the system. And this is being done for the personal financial gain of practitioners. Needless to say, all kinds of reasons may be given to rationalize such practices, but if we don't take care, we will sear our consciences in order to feel comfortable engaging in irregularities. I used to tell myself that I wouldn't want anyone to have any basis to say, when God has blessed me, for them to say that I cheated them to acquire what I had. I didn't want anybody to have any basis to say something like that about me. Our names should not be mentioned in the same breath as the word corruption. And if we are purpose-driven, we would pay attention to that. You know, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government business, but they were unable to do so. Although it is only mentioned that he was not corrupt and not negligent, I want to believe that there were other vital areas of governance in which Daniel may have excelled. I want to take the liberty of personal skills. It is possible that Daniel had excellent interpersonal relationships with not only his equals, but his subordinates as well. He must have shown respect to all and valued their contributions towards effective and efficient handling of state matters. He certainly would not have had the attitude of thinking that he was the only wise person among the governors and the satraps, in spite of his outstanding qualities. And indeed, in spite of his brilliance, he must have had an attitude of humility. If this were not the case, I'm sure they would have found sufficient grounds in that for accusing him before the king. The purpose-driven Christian doctor should cultivate the ability to work with others in order to achieve desired goals, not only in secular assignments, but in the spiritual as well. You know, sometimes when God has placed that in certain positions, it is very easy to forget where we have come from. And therefore, we may begin to feel that we are on top of the world. And that is one thing that Mordecai reminded Esther. He reminded Esther where she had come from. And said, look, if you think that when the king's edict is implemented, you are going to be free, you are making a mistake. We need to remind ourselves where we have come from. If nothing at all, where the Lord has picked you from, brought his grace upon you, and put you where you are at the moment. If we remind ourselves at all times about this, it would enable us to remain focused as Christian doctors and dentists who are purposely driven. You know, the nefarious plan by the satraps and the governors clearly indicates that political intrigue is perhaps as old as human civilization. Efforts to undermine one's competitors by digging dirt about them, something we see much of, especially in modern day politics, is not new. Because these other governors and satraps were looking for something they could use to smear Daniel. And that is what a lot of political people do these days. They look for issues they can use to smear their competitors. Daniel's colleagues must have scratched their heads and gone to great lengths to find a reason to throw accusations at him, only to come up with what was almost a ridiculous plan, which was going to use his religious commitment to find fault with him before the king. In present-day politics, acts of sexual indiscretion are readily used to scupper people's plans and ambitions. Although nothing in this story, nothing in this area of sexual immorality is mentioned in Daniel's story, I think it is an issue we need to tackle seriously if we are to remain true to our calling as Christian doctors. We live in a world in which sexual immorality and sexual perversion of all forms are rampant. Sex and wants Christians to believe that what the Bible considers sin in this respect is nothing to worry about. Fornication and adultery seem not to be frowned upon with the intensity of aversion demanded in the scriptures. You know, I see that the Bible demands of us the higher when it comes to sexual matters. We need to be extra vigilant in our relationships, and I dare say that we can never be too careful with such issues. This vigilance is required ourselves and between us and other health professionals and between us and our patients. The purpose-driven Christian would necessarily pay close attention to this area of their lives, resisting the deceptions of the world and eager to make his life in this area count to the glory of the Lord. The plan by Daniel's colleagues to get rid of him has great lessons for us. And that has to do with how we handle colleagues who may be more gifted and or more blessed than we are. Rather than be envious and jealous of such colleagues, we first of all have to thank the Lord for their gifts and blessings. We must join in celebrating their achievements. We may be motivated by a lot more effort to improve. Ever should we dream of undermining them in order to bring them down. That is what Daniel's colleagues sought to do. We should rather pray for such individuals that God would enable them use their gifts and blessings to his glory and to the benefit of society. You know, I've been wondering why the other governors and satraps were so determined to bring Daniel down. Could it be because he was a foreigner, was a Jew in a foreign land? Or was it because he was an octogenarian? And we'll come to that. Could we be dealing here with ethnocentrism and ageism? And if we don't take care, we may lose our purpose because we are jealous of or we envy someone who might be more gifted or someone who may appear to be more blessed than we are. I'm not sure whether we are aware that theologians generally consider that Daniel was in his 80s at the time of this story. And look at what this octogenarian could accomplish. He was even being considered for the position of second in command of the land. There's no doubt that as we age, we become less and less physically and perhaps mentally able. I used to be able to stand and operate for about 3 hours. Then a few years ago, I realized that after 1 hour, I was tired. Nobody had to tell me to slow down. My office on the maternity block is on the 3rd floor, and I used to run up the steps. If I did that now, I'll probably go into cardiac failure. There's no doubt that as we age, we become less and less able physically. And sometimes mentally, I'm having to strive a bit more to remember certain things. But these things that come with old age do not mean that old age renders one of no consequence in God's scheme of things. The purpose-driven Christian doctor and dental practitioner, while appreciating the limitations imposed by old age, recognizes that it is possible to faithfully serve God's purposes in spite of these limitations. You know, Moses was called to the task of leading God's people out of slavery when he was 80 years old. Somebody has said that Moses spent the first 40 years of life being made to feel that he was somebody. You know, he was in Pharaoh's court, was being made to feel that he was somebody. Then God took over, and over the next 40 years made him realize that he was a nobody. In the next 40 years, God showed him what he can do with a nobody. I am a Methodist, and usual Methodist church, when you are 70, if you are a minister, you go on superannuation. And then they take you off most things that you are supposed to do. But the fact that we are aged does not mean that the things of God must be put aside, especially if we are able. The old can and should become a source of encouragement and inspiration for the younger ones in their service to the Lord in our chosen profession. I believe that as we age, we should give way to the younger generation, whom we should have trained and equipped to take over from us. But as long as we have life and strength, we should make ourselves available to the Lord's work in varied dimensions. The younger generation can benefit tremendously from life's experiences and lessons. There's a need to mentor the next generation in terms of portrayal and maintenance of Christian values in our practice. And if we look at Esther, she had been mentored by her cousin Mordecai. Joshua was a young man of between 20 and 30 years when he became an aide to Moses, who was then 80 years old. And about 40 years later, Moses had to hand over the leadership of the people of Israel to his mentee, Joshua. Perhaps I should throw a challenge to young ones to decide to deliberately become mentors to even younger ones in order to nurture the firm establishment of Christian values in the principles and practice of medicine, especially in Ghana. It is obvious that he took his devotional life very seriously. We can be sure that we can do no less if we are to become purpose-driven Christians and Christian doctors for that matter. I can confidently say that Daniel's devotional life was the powerhouse or the engine room behind his success and achievements. And there are certain characteristics about Daniel's devotional life that need emphasizing. To start with, his devotional life was a priority. It was a priority. One can imagine the very busy schedule he may have had, yet he considered his time with God so important for his survival that he made time to go before him 3 times a day. This is not to suggest that we must necessarily come before God 3 times a day. After all, the Bible enjoins us to pray at all times. 1 Thessalonians 5:16-18. But what this means is that we must set aside time each day when we come before the Lord for him to speak to us in his word and for us to. And this is important because we doctors almost always seem to be very busy. We don't. But there is no reason for us to neglect our times of private, personal devotion before the Lord. Secondly, there was consistency about his devotional life. He says, as he had done before. So it was his normal practice. Daniel did not suddenly resort to a devotional life when he faced personal danger. Indeed, the devotional life formed the basis of the accusation that put his life in danger. So he continued with his devotional activities as if nothing had happened, even though he knew that there was the possibility of death. He refused to compromise. I don't know what your devotional life is. It's never too late to start or restart if this doesn't form an important part of your life. Daniel must have cultivated his devotional life from the time of his youth. And it is obvious that age did not create a sense of complacency that diminished his zeal for that activity. There's always the danger, if we have been Christians for a long time, of developing a sense of complacency